The Supreme Court of the United States expressly took away a constitutional right from the American people that it had already recognized. They didn't limit it, they simply took it away. That's never been done to a right so important to so many Americans, but they did it.
Frustration among Democrats following the Supreme Court's ruling on abortion, as the president and his party tried to capitalize on the public anger by mobilizing their supporters ahead of November's midterm elections. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Two rulings last week by the US Supreme Court. One, overturning a 50-year-old court decision that guaranteed a woman's national right to terminate a pregnancy. The other, expanding the right to bear arms, have thrown America's growing divisions into sharp relief, calling into question whether the court truly represents public opinion in the United States. A poll taken after last week's rulings were announced found that only 39% of those asked said they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the Supreme Court, while 58% said they have not very much or no confidence at all in the court. Another poll found that the court's ruling on abortion, which overturned 1973's Roe v. Wade, made Democratic respondents 50% more likely to vote in November's midterm elections. But can the party capitalize on this? Or will Republicans continue to push through policies that appear to be unpopular with a majority of Americans? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Fred Hicks, a Democratic political strategist. Fred Hicks, the Supreme Court of the United States has yet to issue more potentially divisive rulings before its current term ends on immigration and climate change. But what impact will its most recent rulings have? The abortion ruling, the ruling on gun control, what impact will they have on Democrats' prospects in the midterms? Will they galvanize enough voters to turn out and vote?
I think both Republicans and Democrats believe that particularly the Roe ruling has the potential to galvanize Democratic support, Democratic vote, and to potentially swing white women from Republicans over to Democrats. Remember, President Trump received about 57% of the white women, or the vote from white women, according to exit polls. If Democrats are able to pull that down, say, to 50-50, particularly in key states, then that would be a tremendous win, and it could actually impact the House and the Senate this year.
But can they? Because Biden received only 44% of the votes of white women in that election. Women in the U.S. outnumber men. They outvote men. They tend to vote Democratic, but they're certainly not a sure bet for Democrats, are they?
Certainly not. And prior to the Supreme Court rulings, it looked like the Republicans were going to have a great year, both in taking back the House and potentially winning the Senate, because remember, right now the Senate is split 50-50, and you have a few key gubernatorial races across the country. The thinking or the fear, if you're a Republican right now, is that with the Roe ruling, that actually will put the House back in play and will benefit Democrats in the Senate races and potentially in key gubernatorial races, like in Georgia, where you have Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp facing off against one another again.
But do they have the strategy, though, to turn this hope into a reality? President Biden hopes to capitalize on the popular anger after the ruling on Roe v. Wade. He says Roe is on the ballot, personal freedom is on the ballot, liberty and equality and the right to privacy are all on the ballot. But will it be enough to energize these Democrats? I mean, Republicans have traditionally made Supreme Court issues much more central to their campaigning. They seem to push the boundaries far more than Democrats. Isn't that fair to say?
More than fair to say. And honestly, a lot of the frustration that you're seeing right now within the Democratic Party, particularly in the House, stems from the fact that even though this decision was leaked several weeks ago, the administration does not yet seem to have a plan for how to number one, for how to protect access to reproductive health for women, and number two, how to capitalize on this politically. Over the weekend, we saw tweets from AOC and other leading Democrats, and also from the majority leader, Nancy Pelosi, just on Tuesday earlier this week, we're putting forth policies and plans because the administration has not done that yet. And again, there's a lot of frustration amongst Democrats right now because again, the memo was leaked several weeks ago. There's been plenty of time to develop a strategy to protect health and to capitalize on this politically. And right now, it doesn't look like the administration has done either. They still seem like they were caught flat-footed.
Well, they seem more than flat-footed. They seem stuck because
Yeah.
there is, as you say, that growing frustration among Democrats with the leadership of the party, with President Biden. Republicans spent the last 40 years or so filling the court with justices who would overturn Roe, and that's what they did. They spent decades, and certainly in the last few years, flipping state legislatures. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have Democrats stuck with low approval ratings for the president, a Senate split 50-50. I mean, can they really turn things to their advantage between now and the midterms?
Absolutely. Let's be clear. The outlook at this point right now for Democrats is pretty bleak. And as you mentioned, Republicans have had a strategy and a plan, particularly around Roe, for the last 40, 50 years, both at the legislative level, the state house level, that is, and especially with the courts. So if you look at the number of appointments that President Trump made versus President Obama, and going back and forth over administrations, you've seen that Republican presidential administrations and Republicans at every level have put a heavy emphasis on the judiciary, and Democrats have not. Democrats get really excited about the presidential election and the big, high-profile gubernatorial elections, but the action really is at the state legislative level. And looking at the Roe decision, there are 25 states that are poised to ban or severely limit access to abortions across the country. And that's at the state legislative level. I think what we're going to see from the Democratic Party is that if the administration does not step up and step up fast, you're going to see other people within the Democratic Party stepping up to fill the void. Again, whether it's AOC or Speaker Pelosi, or whether it's someone like a Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who's been very outspoken over the last week, demanding that Democrats and the administration do something, someone is going to step into this void because there's just too much at stake for the Democratic Party.
And the court could go much further than curtailing or banning abortion rights. How much of a concern is there among Democrats that the court could chip away at more fundamental rights? Because one of the justices, Thomas Clarence, clearly stated that in future cases, the court should reconsider at least 3 landmark rulings that protected the right to contraception, same-sex relations, and same-sex marriage. He says the court has a duty to correct the error. Will it matter to voters?
It should. Well, again, that comes back to Democrats. So I think that one of the things you're going to see happen is that there's going to be some type of message that comes out that shows or talks to voters about why the Roe ruling and the concurring opinion that Justice Thomas issued, why that's important.
It certainly will be. Fred Hicks, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The end of Roe v. Wade was not the Supreme Court's only controversial decision last week. It also struck down a century-old New York state law that restricted who can carry concealed handguns in public, to the dismay of gun control and safety advocates.
Today, the United States Supreme Court of America voted 6-3 to expand gun rights. This is an absolute disgrace. When we are seeing increased violence in America through guns, this sign here is now over 2,400 innocent children wounded and killed through gun violence.
And the Supreme Court could decide on another challenge to gun restrictions as early as this week. I'm joined by Stamboulieh, a lawyer for the plaintiff in that lawsuit. Stamboulieh, your case in the Supreme Court, Young v. Hawaii, argues that Hawaii's restrictions on the open carry of firearms, and in fact on the carrying of concealed firearms as well, violate the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Why do you believe, though, that the state's strict gun laws violate people's constitutional right?
So, in the United States, we have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Hawaii has written out bear arms out of the Second Amendment. And basically, they made it to where you cannot carry a firearm outside of your home at all. You can't carry it concealed. You can't carry it openly. You just can't have it outside of your home for self-defense.
But doesn't it all go back to one's interpretation of the text of the Second Amendment, 27 words that essentially say this: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The words well-regulated seem to imply that states have the power to regulate gun ownership to protect the lives of their citizens. Shouldn't it be up to each state, including Hawaii, to decide whether the state's citizens should be allowed to carry concealed weapons or non-concealed weapons in public?
So in 2008, our Supreme Court ruled that you have an individual right to carry to own a firearm in your home, to keep it in your home. And then in 2010, what they did is they incorporated that constitutional amendment, the Second Amendment, against the states. Originally, it was thought to only apply to the federal government. And this is, a long time ago. And now they have said that it applies to the states. So when you say that the states can regulate it, the states do in fact regulate it. However, they can't ban you from carrying it. And that in fact is what Hawaii has done, because they don't issue any permits at all. The argument is not that they can't regulate it at all. It's they can't, by means of a regulation, completely destroy the right. And in fact, that's what Hawaii has done. And that's what the Supreme Court has found that New York has done by taking it and making it so incredibly difficult for ordinary people to carry a firearm outside your home.
Well, hold on, though. You mentioned the landmark 2008 ruling by the Supreme Court in the case of Heller, who was a police officer, v. the District of Columbia, where this police officer was essentially suing D.C. for the right to bear arms in his home for self-defense. That's quite different to the right to bear arms outside and in public.
Right, and I mean it is, because one, you're in your home, right, and the other one you're not. So, but that doesn't mean just because you're outside that you don't also have a right to carry a firearm. And you don't only get attacked in your home. You probably have less of a chance.
Aren't you stretching the meaning and the interpretation of the Constitution by suggesting that that is what was intended? And doesn't it put far more people at risk the more weapons there are in people's hands?
I don't know that it does create more risk with people carrying guns outside. There's studies that go back and forth on both sides of the issue. The gun control groups want to show, how safe Hawaii is because they don't allow carry outside, or how dangerous other states are because they do allow it. But it doesn't take it to the full effect of a whole slew of things, mental health, all different kinds of things that lead people to commit crimes. And you don't have to commit crime with a gun. You can do it like in the UK, they do it with knives. We had a border patrol, not a border patrol, a 18-wheeler truck, a lorry, if you want to call it that, that was found with 50 deceased migrants that had tried to cross the border. And in San Antonio, they found them deceased in the vehicle. So, I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to commit crime, to commit murder. It doesn't have to be with a gun.
Of course there is, but you know that there is an epidemic of gun violence in this country, and the country is overflowing with firearms. Hawaii has some of the strictest gun laws in the United States and the lowest rate of gun deaths of all 50 states. Why shouldn't the state be allowed to continue to regulate the purchase and use of firearms?
Well, they do regulate, and they can continue to regulate.
And hasn't that made
firearms.
Hawaii citizens safe or safer?
I don't think it's made them safer. I mean, it just depends on what your definition of that is. But, when we ratified our Constitution back in the late 1700s, and the amendments to the Bill of Rights, you can't say that all kinds of the Bill of Rights, they can cause some injury, right? So we have the Fourth Amendment, which doesn't allow for unreasonable searches and seizures. We could just get rid of it, right? And then the police could just search everybody and make everybody safe. But there's some kind of risk to living in a free country that we're not going to do away with, even though some people will commit bad acts with the tools that we provide them, with the Fourth Amendment or freedom of speech. Everyone likes to say you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. And it's absolutely not true. You can shout fire in a crowded theater if it's on fire. So, can some people abuse the First Amendment? Sure.
Gun control advocates, gun safety advocates say that there are already far too many guns, too many weapons in private hands. There are already more guns in civilian hands in the United States than there are people. It's actually the equivalent of 120 firearms for every 100 citizens, according to the statistics. Won't all of these rulings lead to more tragic deaths? Don't states have the duty, the responsibility to regulate guns and decide who gets to carry them just in order to secure people's safety?
Well, I mean, I think that we're going back to the premise of the states can't regulate, and nothing in the Supreme Court opinion said they can't regulate. The Supreme Court opinion was very clear on what they could continue to do, and that was to regulate firearm carry. There's nothing to say that someone that's a felon can go out and buy a handgun and carry it legally because it's illegal. And the Supreme Court ruling didn't say that that was legal now. They still have a chance to regulate.
All right, for now, thank you so much, Stephen Stamboulieh, for joining me.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Last week's Supreme Court gun ruling and references to state rights, the term many supporters of American slavery used to justify violence to protect that institution during the Civil War, have exacerbated already existing tensions between states and the federal government. In recent years, there has been a significant increase in the number of Americans who believe that violence is justified in advancing their political goals, as exemplified in the January 6, 2021 attempted insurrection, when thousands tried to forcibly stop Congress from certifying the results of the 2020 presidential election. A poll in April by the Southern Poverty Law Center found that 44% of Americans agree that the United States seems headed toward a civil war in the near future, including 53% of Republicans and 39% of Democrats. Joining me now is Stephen Marche, the author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. He wrote in a recent article, quote, "The question is no longer whether there will be a civil conflict in the United States. The question is how the sides will divide, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how those strengths and weaknesses will determine the outcome." Stephen Marche, when you look at Republicans' control of one crucial lever of power, one key institution, which is the Supreme Court, is there any doubt that Republicans and conservatives today have the upper hand in this political battle that we're seeing in America?
Well, I think the Republicans have a series of advantages in the electoral system, not just the Supreme Court, where, 5 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices were selected by presidents who did not win the popular vote, but also in the Electoral College, where they have massive advantages, and also in the Senate, where by 2040, about 30% of the country will control 70% of the seats. So they definitely have a massive electoral advantage. On the other hand, they're less popular than the Democrats. And it's also probably worth pointing out, I think it will matter in the ensuing conflict, that 70% of, Biden voting counties accounted for 70% of GDP. So, the left has money and tech on its side.
But how much of a decisive factor, though, is it that Republicans have that electoral advantage when it comes to the way the Senate is shaping up in years to come?
Well, I mean, it hugely matters. It gives them this enormous advantage, is why they can do things like the Dobbs decision, where it is a very unpopular decision, and it also isn't reflected in electoral politics, but they can nonetheless do it because they have this institutional advantage. But the incipient crisis in the United States isn't really about conservative or Democrat, like Republican or Democrat. What it is about the decline of trust in the institutions, which is also underway, and the sense among ordinary Americans that they no longer live in a democracy and that their institutions no longer reflect the popular will, and that, of course, will sort of destroy everyone.
And it's a lack of trust in so many of the country's institutions. When you look back, though, at the origins of this incipient civil conflict, as you call it, where do you trace it back to? Because it didn't all start now, or even with Trump. I mean, the rise of white supremacy didn't just happen overnight, did it?
No. Trump is just a symptom. Like Trump, I really believe that everything I described in my book would have happened if Hillary Clinton were elected. The experts on civil conflict and on right-wing extremism in the United States typically date its origin to 2008. Specifically the housing crisis, where you just had an explosion of conspiracy theories out of that. And also the election of Barack Obama, where you had a sort of multicultural iconography replacing a white iconography in the national institutions. So, the deeper origins, like where it goes back to this hatred and this incipient really chaos, that's kind of a philosophical question that I don't pretend to be able to answer. But 2008 is a really good starting point because a lot of the things that spiral out of control now started then.
And we're seeing this tug of war, aren't we, between states and among states, but between some states and the federal government on the issue of abortion, for example. I mean, states like Arizona, Arkansas, and Texas on the one hand, other states like California, Washington State, and Oregon on the other. Who wins in this battle?
Well,
I mean, you know, again.
I mean, nobody wins. Like, what wins is chaos, right? Like, what loses is order. I mean, you are entering, America is entering a situation now where, you know, certain states like Texas are seriously in resistance to federal authority. And on the other hand, you know, with the Dobbs decision, you have essentially the end of equality under the law because, you know, women in Missouri are different legal entities, frankly, than women in Illinois. Right? They don't have the same rights and they don't have the same control over their future. And so that is a situation where you're in effect already not a united country, right? Where you're not all the same. That where you happen to live in the United States actually makes a huge difference to what political and legal reality you're living in. And you know that, and how long that can be maintained is really unknown. You know, these exact same legal questions were haunted the United States for about 20 years before the first Civil War. And now, you know, the same question of equality under the law has returned.
And how much of a test will all this be for the US's federal system? And this notion that the US, as many of its allies have been saying in the last few days, is actually backsliding, going backwards when it comes to the protection of human rights at home.
Rights are being taken away from people. And it seems pretty clear that the Supreme Court is determined to take more rights away from people than they currently have, which is actually pretty unprecedented in American history. Like, they don't actually take away rights. I mean, they are slow to give rights sometimes, but to actually take them away is quite different. You know, I think the federal crisis is already here. Like, people talk about Trump sparking a constitutional crisis. I mean, you're in it. You're in the constitutional crisis right now. And I mean, that's how I think. Like, it's very clear that neither side is really willing to accept the decisions of federal authority when they oppose them. I mean, the left-wing states, the Democrat states like California, openly resisted federal immigration mandates during the Trump administration. And, you know, they had to be told, like, this is nullification. They had to be taken to court to do that. So it really does go both ways in that sense, where Democrats just will not be ruled over by a Republican president, and Republicans will not be ruled over by a Democratic president. And the fracturing is happening. I mean, it's not.
So beyond the fracturing and the chaos, beyond the chaos and the fracturing, how does it all end? You know, how does it all end?
Well, I have 5 scenarios in my book that are sort of different avenues that it could take. No one knows what it will be like. I mean, I tried in the book to stay as close to the best available models. So, you know, lots of people are out there making predictions. I don't want to join them because I don't think you need to make scary predictions. Like, the reality on the ground is really quite science fiction-y and scary enough.
All right. On this note, Stephen Marche, author of The Next Civil War. Great pleasure to have you. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, as Stephen Marche notes, the cracks in the foundations of the United States are widening, and while the outcome may not be determined, the battle will be fought on several fronts. The first has been waged in the Supreme Court, where Republicans have scored 2 important victories on gun rights and abortion, taking control of an institution that has arguably become a more powerful branch of government than the US Congress. With their 6-3 supermajority on the court, Republicans have effectively and decisively seized power from the legislative branch to deliver on their party's right-wing political agenda. Just as the Republican-appointed majority on the court ruled that individual states should have the power to regulate and ban abortions, they also ruled that individual states cannot regulate or restrict gun ownership. The court's anti-commandeering doctrine, which says that the federal government cannot require states to adopt or enforce federal law, is being applied selectively to serve that agenda, with the Supreme Court deciding when states should have the final say and when they shouldn't. And so, in short, while the court has once again exposed the inherent fault lines within the US federal system that rests on the concept of dual sovereignty, it is reshaping America's political, social, and cultural landscape with its evolving, or as some might argue, backward interpretation of the Constitution. 6 members of the court will opine and rule on critical issues that could affect the lives of 330 million Americans and generations more to come, as the court's empowered and increasingly emboldened majority continues to rule supreme. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.